She'd been sleeping under his door for 3 weeks, but the night she finally moved, she left something that made his chest ache. The rain started like a whisper, thin as fingertip water against glass. It found the little cracks in the stairwell, the seams between the old bricks, the sloping metal awning over his door. It found her. For weeks it had found her. He had first noticed the patch of movement because of the sound. A soft, persistent rustle at the bottom of the door. A slight padding, like someone walking on eggshells. He thought, at first, it was a rat. A sound familiar in that building, the kind of small nuisance that lives where the heat is imperfect and the pipes rattle at night. Then the sound turned into breathing, regular and deliberate, and he realized it was paws. And then a tail, and then fur. The stairlight was a lazy orange. It made the rain look older than it was. He opened the door once, just a crack, the way you check on a child without waking them. She was there. Small. A compact roll of tabby stripes tucked against the threshold, her paws tucked neatly, like someone had folded her to fit the space. Her eyes were closed. Her chest rose and fell, shallow and steady. Whoever she had been before, wherever she had come from, it did not show in that moment. There was only survival sleeping in the doorway. He remembered thinking two things at once. One, she was pregnant. It was the way her belly sat low and round, the careful way she shifted against the cold. Two, she had chosen the wrong door. He had never been the kind of person who fed strays. He lived alone. He taught high school math. He liked routines. He liked the small control of precise things. The pandemic had turned his schedule into a quiet room. He had been carrying loneliness like a coat he forgot to hang up. It sat heavy on him. He told no one. He did not know how to name the small emptiness that tightened behind his ribs when the apartment stayed too quiet. He had not meant to be the kind of man who would stop, each night, and watch a cat breathe. But there she was, night after night, catalogued by the door like a small, stubborn presence. She did not come inside. She did not reach out with paws. She stayed in the space where the outside met his threshold. She had rules. He had rules. They learned the edges of each other's borders in silence. The first week was a set of small tests. He left a saucer of milk by the door. It was a domestic instinct and also something to keep his hands busy. She accepted the milk at midnight, hunched over it like praying. The next morning the saucer was empty but untouched around the edges, like she was careful to keep some honor in the act of taking. She did not come closer than the length of one body from the threshold. Her ears twitched at every footstep, at every late train, at the occasional shout from the street below. She flinched at umbrellas. She had a way of folding herself into the step like a memory trying not to wake. He named her in the small private way of people who speak to things that cannot answer. Not out loud, not at first. He thought maybe Tabby would be too obvious. He thought perhaps names were presumptuous. But one night in the rain, after the third week of her consistent presence, he muttered a name that felt right and old. Maggie, he said. It landed soft, and she did not leave. Names were small invitations that did not demand a reply. The weather kept them both honest. Rain made the stairs smell like cold pennies. It made the air taste metallic with iron. The city seemed to fold in on itself. The noise damped to a distance. Her fur took on the smell of the street. Oil, wet cardboard, a faint sweetness of food left on a stoop. In the mornings, the doormat held the impressions of her tiny paws. In the evenings, the light under the door caught the curve of her spine, a line of shadow and stripes. He was careful at first because he was careful with other things. He bought a thin wool blanket and set it beside the door, tucking it under the overhang so it would not be soaked. He put out food in disposable containers, chicken, rice, the sort of quiet leftovers that still felt like a kindness. She ate without fury. There was no greed in her. There was a measured necessity. Her tongue grazed the bowl, and she lifted her head to look at him, not challenging and not pleading, simply calibrated to the fact of him standing there. In those early nights, he watched how she observed him. She was not a cat given to trust. When he emerged in the doorway, she would lift her gaze in a slow, almost imperceptible motion. Her pupils would widen, but not like the way a pet's would when greeting a familiar face. There was a distance in them, a map he had no right to read. Sometimes she would blink, just once. Slow feline blinks are, he'd learned, a kind of offering, a soft promise that the world is not currently a threat. He returned the blink because it felt like an honest transaction, and it reassured him that communication could exist without language. They were building a grammar. He began to schedule his nights around a lighter. He would stand at the door, listening to the rain, and watch her breathe. She would sometimes raise her head and watch the distant headlights sweep by, as, if tracing the arcs of other people's lives, he projected onto her the stories of the people that had been before, the owners who might have lost her, the step away from a home that had been too loud, a truck, a sudden chaos. It didn't matter if the stories were true. What mattered was that he could imagine them, and in doing so, feel less alone. On the 7th night, he found her small mouth smeared with red. It was not blood. It was a dark, sticky smear, the kind of residue that clings to fur after someone eats something messy. He cleaned it with a wet tissue, careful the way one cleans a little animal who is not yet yours. She did not object. She did not purr. She simply stayed, letting him do what he wanted as if he was a clock and she was waiting for the hand to come around. He learned the cadence of her feet, the specific way she shifted her weight before deciding whether to move, how she lingered, longer on rainier nights, how she seemed to count the footsteps that passed her threshold, perhaps measuring the level of danger beyond the door. He noticed the subtle changes in her gait when the wind came from the east. He noticed when she left half of her food sometimes, like a memory stored for later, or an offering she refused to consume alone. By the 2nd week he had started, speaking again in that strange, hushed way people speak when they are afraid to wake their own feelings. He said things he had withheld for years, soft confessions about his mother's hospital bed, the small ways his marriage had deflated like a bicycle tire, the exam he had failed and the paper he couldn't stop reading over and over. He did not expect answers. He expected only the blank, comfort of being heard. Maggie listened as well as a cat could. She would sit, alert, as if the sound of his voice were another weather pattern, something to resonate with, not to alter. She never leaned against him in those early days. She did not accept the warmth of a shoulder or the steady press of a hand. Sometimes after his sentences ended, she would step forward an inch. A small test. That inch felt like a confession. In return, there were nights when he almost made a mistake. Human compassion is clumsy. Men who live alone often find their kindnesses sharp. He remembered one night, 3 a.m., when he found her curled up with a soggy plastic wrapper in her mouth. He pried it free. He tried to pick her up to bring her inside. Her body stiffened, the world rearranged. He stopped. Her eyes were flat, with a reality he had not considered. She was the kind of cat that had learned to avoid being owned. She had learned that proximity can mean danger. She had learned to be careful with the hands of people like him, the ones with good intentions, and uncertain follow-through. So he learned to wait. Patience became the thing he practiced. It filled the afternoons formerly given to other ambitions. He learned to like the wait. It made the patience itself feel like a presence. He would come home and tidy the bowls and fold the blanket and stand inside his door and look out at the little figure, like a guardian of the threshold. He would listen to the rain and tell himself small truths, that the weight in his chest might one day lift. That being careful could become a path toward something softer. She had a pattern that felt almost ritual. At dusk, when the city's lights blurred into one another, she would appear. She would take her spot, tail wrapped like a comma, head tucked. She would not sleep in the stairwell. She would watch through the tiny gap under his door with a patience so complete it felt like prayer. Sometimes she's close enough that he could hear the faint scent of hay and garbage and the kind of sweetness that belongs to animals who eat things scavenged from the world. He began to think of her as a ledger of the city's waste, carrying the smell of other people's leftovers and other people's hands. He began to notice little intel she collected, bits of string stuck to her coat, a small, impossible feather caught in the stitching of her ears, a blue twist tie from a bread bag snagged around her tiny toe. Things that suggested she had been somewhere else, further down the block, perhaps in a garden or a dumpster, perhaps under a car or behind a market stall. She would sometimes arrive with a faint scrape along one hind leg, the kind of mark that freckled fur with dried salt. At night, when the building hummed with the mechanical heart of old radiators, the two of them listened to different things. He, to the steady ticking of a life that had become routine. She, to the world outside that bled into his threshold. She would lift her head at the sound of a dog in the distance and tilt her ears like a radio dial. He would watch her and remember that he had once loved in a way that required him to move. He had once packed boxes, closed doors, driven away. He had once thought himself enough. The cat made him remember how hollow that belief could be. 3. Weeks became a landscape. The rain ebbed and surged. He watched her grow more precise in her movements. She seemed to keep the evenings by degree, not in leaps. She began to acknowledge him with a tilt that suggested recognition, rather than mere tolerance. She learned the exact moment he would step out to refill the bowl, and she would look up, count the seconds, and then settle again. She learned the little pattern of his breath. He learned to watch for the small muscle that twitched under her chin when someone passed too close. She slept closer to the door as the weather turned colder. The blanket under the awning became a ritual altar where she laid the little physics of her life. The blanket smelled of the city and sometimes of him, if he had rested his hand there. He started sleeping with the window cracked a fraction, so he could hear the world and be near it without committing to the motion of leaving. His bed. These were small adjustments. He would call them small, practical things. But they added up. They created a common grammar. One night, a week on from the small smear on her mouth, she shifted position and let him see the outline of her belly more clearly. It was rounder than before. Not just full. It read as imminent. The skin, the fur, the way she tucked her legs beneath her. It all suggested that the waiting had a purpose beyond simple survival. There would be kittens soon. The thought landed like a pebble dropped in the quiet of his chest. It stirred concentric circles. He had never been a father to anything but the occasional succulent that had refused to die. He was not prepared for the idea of a living thing depending on him. Responsibility is heavy in ways that are not always noble. It is the kind of thing that makes the simplest acts feel sacred. Filling bowls, setting out towels, glancing at the small slope under the door. He felt suddenly like the person responsible for a small future. The thought frightened and thrilled him in the same breath. There was a tiny seed of ending that planted itself like a stone in the story even then. He noticed the way she watched the neighboring door across the hall. Twice she stood and padded evenly to the left, hovering near a different set of stairs, and then turned back to his entry without touching the knob. Her eyes lingered as if remembering something there. He had seen a woman 2 doors down who fed other cats. She had a small bowl of her own on the stoop and a cat of her own that slept inside the building. He wondered, in the small way men wonder about how choices will line up in the future, whether Maggie had done the math wrong, whether she had meant to go to that other door and mistaken his for the warmth of someone else, whether, in choosing him, she had chosen a person who was not yet ready. The thought prickled at the edges of him and refused to leave. The rain made everything so honest. It blurred edges and broke habits. It was the kind of weather that makes secret things more visible. On a night when the rain fell hard enough to erase the distant hum of the highway, he found her doing something he had not expected. She rose carefully and limped a few feet along the threshold. The motion was awkward, deliberate. She pushed her head against the crack of the door in a small measured pressure as if trying to test the boundary between the inside and the outside. He opened the door just a breath. She sniffed the air, a quick, precise inhale. Her whiskers trembled. For a beat, a ridiculous, aching beat. He thought she might cross the line. She did not. Instead, she sat down and started to clean herself, licking a paw and rubbing it along the line where his carpet met the concrete. It was a domestic act, intimate and private. It was as if she was practicing for a life she had not yet allowed herself to have. He wanted to reach out and pull her into his arms and stroke away the city. He wanted to promise her something he could not yet guarantee. That night, he lay awake much later than usual. The rain sang against the roof in a loud, repetitive rhythm. He counted heartbeats like a man counting the minutes between blows. He thought about all the tiny hesitations he had in his life, the paused decisions and unmade commitments. He thought about the cost of being careful and the cost of being rash. He thought about how strange it was that a small animal had become a mirror, reflecting the places in him that had hardened like old paint. She stayed. She came each evening unless the weather was severe and the nights were sharp. When the cold, left and the rain eased into drizzle, she would move closer. Her food remained measured. Sometimes she ate with the calm of someone who has tasted too many full plates to be surprised by them anymore. Sometimes she took half and left the rest. The building did not clap for small mercies. The neighbors were shadows that hurrying past, lives that intersected briefly and then folded away. Once an old tenant hammered on the radiator and cursed the landlord. Once someone moved in upstairs with the jangling keys of a new arrival. The city kept its indifferent rhythm. But in the eyed stairwell, in front of his door, a small routine had congealed into a strange sort of altar, his hand within reach of hers. 2 lives lined up at the edge of a possibility. He told himself he would not become a man defined by a cat. He promised to keep things measured and rational. The promises did not hold. They never do. He started to index his days to her presence. The nights he had eaten dinner alone, the mornings he had made coffee for one, the afternoons he had let the silence stretch too long. Each time he came home to find her waiting, he felt the quiet ameliorate. The pressure in his chest, the one he had named as loneliness, eased, if only a fraction. And in the rain, in the soft, incandescent light under the door, something had quietly begun. You're here listening, and that means more than you know. If you feel safe in these stories, your one subscribe helps me keep this quiet little corner alive. Thank you for being part of this peaceful world. Have you ever had an animal wait for you even when you didn't ask them to? He began to measure his days by the soft things. Not by the calendar, not by shifts or meetings, but by the small mathematics of her presence. A bowl placed by the door, a blanket folded under the awning, the exact way he would slide the deadbolt, without the heavy clack that might startle her. The routine was a thin scaffold that kept him upright. It kept him from thinking too hard about other things. About the letter from his mother's doctor. About the quiet that had lived in his apartment since the divorce. About the way his hands could go on autopilot, doing chores while his mind stalled in the hallway of memory. Each morning he woke with a quiet curiosity. Did she come last night? Had the rain driven her away? He would stand at the threshold for one small moment, listening to the hum of the street, and hope to see the rounded shape of her sleeping by the step. If she wasn't there, his day lost an anchor. If she was, the day had a spine. Days turned into a sequence of small rituals. He set out food at the same times. He learned to use lids and newspapers to cover bowls on windy nights, so the rain wouldn't dilute whatever warmth he could offer. He learned the sound of her footsteps on the concrete, a soft scuff, a measured padding that seemed to count out breaths. He learned the way she shook a puddle off her coat, the way water droplets clung to the fine hairs above her eyes and then fell like tiny, honest jewels. He learned to read her shifts of position like a language. Her eyes were complicated. First, they were the size of careful pupils, narrow and sharp in the streetlight. Over time, they softened. The slow blink came early, tentative, like someone offering a secret without the courage to speak it. It was a feline gesture, yes, but there was a human tenderness in it that he recognized, the fraction of trust a wary thing allows. With each blink, he felt a small filling, of warmth, of room for something to grow. She had strange, specific habits. She preferred the left side of the doormat on windy nights. She would scratch at the corner of the stairwell rail with a single precise claw, a motion like marking time. She loved the smell of old paper. Sometimes she would sit near the discarded newspaper and paw at the pages as if pages could be surfaces to rearrange fate. Once she dragged a strip of thermal receipt along with her and left it tucked into the blanket as if it was treasure. He would find it later, curled like a ribbon of someone else's life. She would vanish sometimes, like all strays do. Days when the bowl stayed full, nights when nothing shifted at the door. He imagined her moving through hidden alleys and beneath market stalls, threading through the city in a map he did not own. He hated those absences. He feared they were proof that her life was not anchored by anything other than need. But she always returned, always. The comeback was a small miracle each time, a reclamation of the groove they had been tracing together. Her disappearance pattern had a logic. She left for a day or two after heavy rain. She left when a pack of dogs had been reported barking in the next block. She vanished when a truck idled too long under the streetlight. And then she would come back, dirty, with the scent of somewhere else layering her fur, and choose the same spot. That choice, repeated like a prayer, was the only promise she allowed. You could see the city in the tiny things she collected. A feather, a curl of plastic, a single potato chip that had somehow survived the foot traffic. He would sometimes find a small offering on the mat, a leaf, a bit of ribbon, a tiny stray hairball. He took those things as messages. He filed them mentally like postcards from an unknown place. They made him feel less like a stranger and more like a participant in some quiet exchange. Her body language was precise and honest. When a person approached the stairwell, she flattened her ears into thin scalpel knives, alert and ready. When a child ran past, she stared, unblinking, like someone trying to decide whether motion implied safety or threat. She would sometimes stand on her hind legs, press her forepaws to the edge of the step, and peer down as if counting faces. She was nothing if not deliberate. He began to talk to her, often in the same way a person talks to a plant. Not expecting conversation, not asking for responses. He told her things he had not told anyone in a long time. Little confessions slipped out like spare change. How he missed the sound of his father's laugh. How he thought about calling his ex once in the middle of the night and then stopped because the muscles in his throat clenched like a fist. How the bills continued to arrive like polite, indifferent rats. He spoke, and she listened. The listening was not consent. It was witness. The cat's presence witnessed the ordinary collapse of his days into small, honest moments. She had a habit of leaning, but not touching. Over weeks, her approach evolved from reserved perches on the step to bolder gestures. She would come closer, stopping inches from the door where the air still smelled like his apartment. Clothes detergent, lemon, the faint smoke of a neighbor's incense. She would stand, then sit, and wait. Her tail would twitch. It was a slow, kind of flirtation with proximity, a test of how much skin of safety she could allow without being exposed. There were nights he would open the door a crack and sit on the lowest step, the exact place in the world where indoors met outdoors. He would stretch his hand out, palm up, and wait. The air smelled of wet concrete and cheap coffee. The light was thin. He would sit for a long time, and often the cat would come, step forward, and let the tip of her nose press to his open hand. A tiny, precise touch. It was a small surrender. He would count it like a benediction. There were other nights when she fled at the faintest sound. Sometimes a loud car, a slammed metal gate. The abrupt laughter of someone in the corridor would send her bounding away like a life-preserving instinct. He would watch her go and feel a low, helpless knifing in his chest. He knew, in a theoretical way, that she had a life outside his symmetry. He felt pained by the idea that the world might be harder to her than it had to be to others. He feared for the kittens growing inside her, something he could not yet touch or guarantee. He learned to read the weather in her behavior. On sultry days, she stretched like someone soaking up the sun, back arched elegantly, belly exposed in the trust of warmth. On wet, cold evenings, her ribs drew in, and she tucked herself small as a coin. When snow dusted the city like powdered Sugar, she shivered as if someone had pulled the thread of her insulation. He found himself buying thicker blankets. He found himself tucking them under the awning stuffed into the crate of a broken photocopier someone had left on the curb. It felt like repair work. He liked that word. It implied possibility. Their bond deepened in someone's small, cumulative way. Not a plot twist, not a dramatic reveal. It happened like moss growing on stone, a slow surrender of space to time. He began leaving the radio on low at night. The human voices cooked into white noise to make the stairwell less hungry. She tolerated it. Occasionally she twitched at an abrupt sound and then settled again as if the noise were a faint tide. He grew accustomed to the rhythm of her breath against the door. He took pleasure in small proofs, the bowl half emptied, the blanket smoothed, a paw print pressed into the dust on his welcome mat. Slowly, the edges of him transformed. He started to answer messages from old friends. He cooked more than microwave dinners. He washed a shirt even if it didn't absolutely need washing. These were tiny things. They were the kind of behaviors that can be overlooked by everyone except someone who watches because something small depends on it. He did them without analysis. He did them because the cat existed in his life like a moral compass he could not ignore. There were nights when he feared letting himself truly feel. Attachment can scare you into stillness. He worried about investment in fragile things. He had been hurt. People close to him had left. There was a ledger of disappointments in his bank of memory, and he kept one eye on it as if reading the fine print could save him. Yet the cat's presence softened those edges. It taught him that anchors do not have to be grand to be reliable. Sometimes they are simply the act of coming home and finding something waiting where it was promised. Out of habit and perhaps superstition, he began to document little changes, scribbling them in the back of a notebook like a private ritual. He wrote, Monday, more forward, sniffed the hand. Thursday, left a scrap of ribbon. Sunday, did not come for 2 days. Odd records, tiny ethnographies of a cat that had become the primary relationship in his most lonely months. He used the notebook to hold himself accountable. He promised himself to be consistent, to be present, to be the sort of person who feeds, who listens, who returns. One morning in late autumn, he found the blanket curled around something that had not been there before. A small, trembling sound. A kitten, not fully opened eyes. So small the world still looked like a bright fog. He froze. The threshold was suddenly a cathedral. The world contracted to the size of his breath. Her body was there, taut with a new kind of focus. She turned her head, met his eyes, and in that moment the entire architecture of the last weeks became the preface to something larger. He had not known she was close to birthing. He had misread signs. Perhaps he had wanted to misread them, to keep the narrative of waiting uncomplicated, but here it was, a kitten, then another, then 3, then 4. A small commotion of life pressed into the faded blanket. Their mouths moved in frequencies too small for him to name. Their skin was thin and fine. They smelled like a beginning. The mother, Maggie, he had been calling her in the privacy of his head, was all stare and motion. She cleaned them with a ferocity that made his palms ache. The care that followed was a flurry of practical tenderness. He bought an old cardboard box and lined it with the thickest towels he could find. He rewired his week to be near the door more. He stayed at night sometimes, sitting on the step as thunder rolled, a human guardian that felt small and huge at the same time. He made a makeshift ramp so she could get up into the doorway's slight threshold without slipping. He put a small heat lamp nearby, discreet and safe to keep the tiny ones warm on the nights the city spit cold. Her guarding instinct was immediate and absolute. She would puff up if someone walked too close. She hissed at a delivery man one afternoon and flattened herself like a low flag, then returned to cleaning the kittens with a vigilance that read like poetry. He realized in those hours how fierce a maternal love could be in something that had once been street tough. Her relationship with wildness was not the same as her relationship with these small beings. She had found the center of her life, and it was tender. The more he watched, the more he learned about patience and pace. Newborn kittens are all motion and heat. They do not respond to the world as adults do. Their eyes were sealed for days. Their ears were folded like unopened letters. He would sit and watch them sleep, their tiny paws twitching in miniature dreams. He would imagine the trajectories of their lives in a way he had not imagined anything in years. He named them in his head: Cinnamon because of a smear of orange, Dot for the white patch, Stripe for obvious reasons, and Quiet, a small one that slept like it had nothing to prove. He was careful not to escalate into ownership. He kept the distance recommended by older neighbors, by the woman who lived 2 doors down and had been feeding feral cats for years. She came once, with a thermos and a tray of boiled fish, and watched the kittens like a midwife. She offered advice delivered in the language of long practice. Keep them warm, don't pick them up too early, make sure the mother trusts you. Her presence was a kind of initiation into a club he hadn't known existed. The woman told him, in an offhand way, that once a stray decides on you, it's like being chosen for a small solemn service. He liked the phrasing. It felt right. Days blurred into the baby hours. He would rise early to put fresh water out, to sweep the area so that the blanket stayed clean. The kittens began to squeal in higher pitches as the second week rolled over. Their eyes pried open like curtains. The first tentative steps were clumsy and adorable. The world shifted for the mother. She relaxed in small ways that made his chest loosen. She slept sometimes near the edge, letting him come close enough to touch the warmth of her back. And then, the breakthrough. It happened on a shallow Tuesday, the kind of day where the sky looked like half-mixed paint. He had been reading beside the door, the book face down, because he wanted to be present, to keep vigil without hovering. The kittens were in the box, luminous and small, and Maggie had let herself fall into a dozy watch. She had the air of someone who had crossed a long distance and allowed herself to rest. He was careful. He moved slowly. He extended his hand. This time she came forward without the usual pause. She stepped up, the pads of her paws whisper quiet against the concrete, and stopped within touching distance. She did not lick at the air. She did not test him with a tentative sniff. She lowered her head and, with an intent that seemed to carry more significance than any word, she pushed the side of her face into his hand. It was a small contact, a soft, deliberate press. Her cheek was warm. Her whiskers brushed his knuckles. There was a slight vibration, a muted purr that made his throat ache with a feeling he had difficulty naming. Relief, maybe. A kind of permission granted. He placed his palm flat against her head, and she stayed. She did not move away. She shifted her weight. She leaned as if weight were an agreement. He felt an odd, fierce tenderness then. A tenderness that did not collapse into sentimentality, but that arranged his day around something simple and necessary. He understood, in that single gesture, that trust could be given in increments, that a life could be reassembled thread by thread. He did not know if she would ever come inside. He did not know if the kittens would survive the roughness of the streets. He did not know if the woman 2 doors down would be able to help with vet appointments, or if someone cruel might take the kittens or the mother away. None of that vanished. But the moment existed. The cat had chosen him in some small way and had allowed the human to be close enough to be part of the daily weather. He wanted to cry. He did not. He sat there with his hand on her head and let the feeling move through him like heat. It felt like a closing of a wound that he had not known he had been carrying for years. He knew then that the relationship would change everything. It would not solve the long, complicated problems that kept him awake at night. It would not call back the people who had left, nor would it pay the bills. But it would be an anchor. The cat's leaning was a ledger, tallied in small, careful amounts. It said, "I believe you enough to rest my head here." It said, "You are not alone." It was not a speech. It was a simple gift. In the days that followed, the distance between them continued to shrink in small increments. She would allow a hand to rest near the kittens. She would accept the scratch behind the ear that had once made her retract. She would sometimes approach the threshold and stare inside, as if weighing the possibility of crossing. He could see the internal calculus, fear versus warmth, choice versus habit. The city outside the door would still howl and bite, but inside the small ring of light near the threshold, there was a new minimum of trust. The breakthrough did not make everything easier. There were still days when she vanished. There were still nights when the nearest pack of stray dogs howled and he could not sleep because he worried she had been chased. There were still times when she refused the offered hand and retreated, like someone burning a bridge rather than crossing it. But those nights were punctuated now by mornings when she would press her cheek to the same palm he offered. The balance had shifted. He continued to keep notes. Now the entries had a different tone. Tuesday, cheek press. Friday, let me pet her while she watches kittens. Sunday, she carried a new ribbon. The ledger was no longer only about survival. It was about soft construction. He kept the notebook like a talisman, proof that small things could be real. The neighbors began to remark on it. "You saved her," the woman 2 doors down said once, and it was less a statement and more an observation of weather. He didn't correct her. He let the phrase stand. It felt inconveniently true. He had not set out to be a rescuer. He had only set out to be present. But presence had the same moral effect. Being there, again and again, was its own form of mercy. At night he would sometimes imagine futures for the kittens. He pictured them as city kings or queens ruling balconies, crawling across laundry lines, slipping into warm pockets. He feared for them, of course. Fear had become a companion he could name. But with the fear came a new kind of hope. A quiet, practical hope. Vet appointments, cages cleaned, talk with the woman 2 doors down about a possible foster. He told himself this was possible because he had already learned to do the small acts that kept them alive. Hope, he realized, was not always a spark. Sometimes it was the slow warming of a blanket. The cat would occasionally bring him odd tokens. A dried leaf that she left on the step like a sigil. Once, almost as if in apology, she brought a single, perfect pebble and dropped it at the edge of the door. It was a small, almost comical gift. He picked it up and held it as if it were heavy, with meaning. He placed it on the windowsill where it caught the light. He began to imagine that she was not only accepting care, but was offering it back in the only currency she had, presence and small treasures. Their days grew into a quiet choreography. He would go out in the morning and come home in the evening. She would be there. Sometimes she would be a little farther down the hall watching. Sometimes she would be inside her cardboard fortress, eyes half-lidded. He would bring home small things to add to the nest. Extra towels, a heating pad disguised beneath a towel, a folded cardboard shield to help the wind not blow through the corner. He acted like someone preparing a room for an arrival he had longed, for it was an odd private satisfaction. Something else began to happen to him. Without any fanfare, he started to forgive himself. Forgiveness was not dramatic. It was not a flash of conversion. It was a series of small, practical permissions. To go to bed without replaying arguments. To eat something simple and enjoy it. To answer a call without preemptive dread. The cat's slow, steady presence made the world less absolute. It allowed the human to breathe in a way that was not panic or performance. At the end of part 2, the night breathed in and out like a slow machine. Rain had started again, thin and staccato on the awning. He had been sitting at the step, a habit now, book face down, a cup of tea cooling beside him. The kittens were asleep in their box, the mother had just fed them, and she had that look, a contentment that belonged to those who have guarded a small life and succeeded. She came forward and, to his astonishment, crossed the smallest threshold. Not a grand entrance, not fully inside, but enough. Her belly just brushed the carpet. She allowed herself the luxury of placing 2 paws onto the first step, then pausing, then placing her full weight, and walking in a few measured steps until the room smelled more like home than street. She paused there, sat down with her tail curled around her paws and looked at him. He reached out slowly. She did not flinch. This time, she moved toward his hand. She leaned into the touch, the palm resting on the curve of her head and sliding down the line of her neck. She let him stroke behind her ears. She closed her eyes like someone who had decided finally to trust a stranger who had become something else. It was the breakthrough he had been waiting for, the small collapse of a wall built from long practice. She was still wild. She would always be that. But she had decided in that small ceremony at the threshold that he could be part of her life. He had not expected such a simple proof. He had imagined drama. He had imagined rescues. Instead, he had a quieter truth. She had allowed herself to be touched, and in that brief, trembling pause, both of them, cat and man, understood something fundamental. Trust can be slow, and when it arrives, it does not shout. It presses, small and certain, like a hand against your chest to check you are still human. Do you think animals know when we're at our lowest? The question came to him in slow pieces, like a thought that had to be assembled. He asked it quietly, the way you ask a friend if you should stay or go, and the stairwell had no answer except the distant thud of a delivery truck and the soft breathing of kittens in a box. After the kittens opened their eyes, after the nights, when Maggie let his hand rest against the side of her head, a new rhythm had crept into the threshold. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the sudden blossoming of a pet who forgot the street. It arrived in increments and in objects. She began leaving things. They were not the kinds of things you could throw away without a small pang. They accumulated with the quiet insistence of evidence. Each morning, when he pushed the door open and let the thin blade of apartment air spill down onto the concrete, something would be waiting on the mat or tucked into the corner of the blanket as if secreted there while the world slept. A tiny white button, a strip of blue ribbon frayed at one end, a feather black at the shaft, white at the tip, a child's crayon nub, chewed and blunt, an earring, small and sterling, its post bent, a single tiny sock the color of peach fuzz. At first he thought it was random. Strays pick things up. Predators and scavengers and the city itself leave tiny shards of life for others to find. But the sequence grew specific. The objects were small, domestic, personal. They belonged to someone who handled them with a hand that had memory. A child's sock suggested a home. A crayon suggested a hand that made marks on paper. The earring suggested a woman who took time to fix herself in front of a mirror. He started laying the objects out on the windowsill, arranging them like small evidence in a case he had no right to be solving. He photographed them with his phone, the way one photographs pages of a letter you can't yet read. He made notes. Monday button, Tuesday ribbon, Thursday pebble and feather. Not because he planned to do anything with the list, but because the act of writing kept him from spinning into a kind of helpless devotion. He catalogued the gifts as if that would render them less mysterious. There was a pattern to where Maggie left things. Some items she placed exactly at the seam of the door, the dividing line where inside met outside. Others were pushed under the corner of the blanket. Once she tucked a crumpled postage stamp into the fold of the towel like a note. She never left more than one item a night, never repeated the same kind of object back to back. There was a kind of thrift in the pattern, a careful generosity. It felt like an offering and like a communication at once. The objects multiplied into a small museum of other people's lives. He would pause, cup his hand over the crayon, and imagine the toddler who had gripped it. Tiny fingers stained red or blue. He would hold the earring and picture a woman who had once caught her reflection and tilted her head to peer at the way the metal caught the light. These imagined faces filled the empty places in his own memory with strangers. He liked the strangers. They were softer, less demanding than the people who had left. Then the other pattern emerged, the departures. Maggie had always been a creature of roots. She left each evening and returned each morning. She left in the same hour and returned in the same hour, as if she were measuring her life by the arc of lights across the block. But over time, she began to vary the path she took. She would exit the stairwell on the left instead of the right. She would skirt the market instead of the parking lot. Sometimes she would vanish for an afternoon. Sometimes she would be absent for a full day and then come back with mud on her paws and the smell of something like milk and soap clinging to her fur. He tried to map her routes in his head. She appeared to favor the back alleys, the places between buildings where bins piled. and stray cardboard made warm beds. But the objects she brought back suggested something else. The child's crayon, the single sock, the folded note. Those were not things found in alleys. Someone was leaving things lying in places that made sense for Maggie to gather them. Someone had hands that dropped a sock on a stoop or left a hair tie on a windowsill. The neighbor across the hall, the woman who had fed other cats for years, noticed too. "She's working for somebody," she said once, like she was reading a weather report. "Cats don't leave ribbons for no reason. They collect what's important." Her voice had the kind of certainty that comes from having watched 100 small lives. He accepted the phrase and let it settle. It made the strange objects feel less like theft and more like part of a system, an exchange. His curiosity became a slow ache. He found himself watching the hallway at dusk with the precise, anxious patience of someone waiting for the end of a bad dream. He would position himself in the doorway with a cup of tea and a book he never read. He would watch Maggie move out into the world with the small, predatory grace she had always possessed. Her body was a study in economy, muscles rolling like rope under fur, paws placed exactly, tail telling the story of interest and suspicion. She would slip past the building's squeaky side gate and vanish into a corridor of cinder block that rose between two empty lots. Once compulsion got the better of him. He followed at a distance. He kept to the shadows and used his phone screen as a small, guilty torch. He told himself he would not act. He would only observe. He wanted to see where she went. He wanted to satisfy the small curiosity that had become a kind of conversation in his nights. He nearly lost her twice in the dark of the alleyways. She slipped under a parked car like a shadow swallowing itself. She vanished into a thicket of overgrown garden that belonged to the building 2 blocks down. He circled on the far side of the fence, slowed to a walk, careful not to flush the life he sought. For a time he lost the thread. The city is a place where things that want to disappear do so effortlessly. When he found her, she was sitting on a low wall outside a ground-floor flat. The window above her was cracked and warm light spilled out. There was a small curtain drawn aside. He crouched behind a dumpster and watched. The flat's door opened, and a small child's voice, a thin, bright thing, said something he couldn't make out. A woman's laugh answered it. The child ran past the doorway, bare feet slapping the threshold. Maggie did not move. She sat and watched, and then padded forward and rubbed her head against the child's ankle. The child squealed with delight and scooped the cat up. He had been within reach and had not moved. He had been close enough to knock, to speak, to claim, to demand an explanation, and he had not. He watched from the dark like someone peeking through blinds. Pride and shame made his palms cool. He had no right. Yet his chest ached with a new, small, bitter jealousy. Maggie, for her part, seemed to understand something about both of them. She accepted the child's embrace. She was pressed into the small human chest and patted with the tender, clumsy affection of a child. Then, as if remembering another duty, she was set down at the doorway and she sauntered back to the dark like a courier who had finished delivering a parcel. She left behind a peal of laughter and a small plastic soldier. She returned to the staircase of his building and dropped the soldier on his mat like a confessional. Her eyes met his from across the threshold, and for a fraction of a second there was a look between them that read like, "I have places. You are one of them." It was both a relief and a jab. The relief was simple. She was not entirely wild. She had soft rooms in other people's lives. She had stories that were not salvaged from trash. But the jab hurt. There was a measure of his ownership he could not deny. He had fed her. He had watched her births. He had stayed. Her service to another small person felt like a slight, though. He knew the feeling was his own insecurity dressed up as grievance. From then on, the gifts took on another hue. They were not merely scraps. They were tokens of other lives, and sometimes they were maps back to them. The crayon, the tiny sock, the earring. They were all things Maggie presented like a courier presenting stamps from journeys. He started to think of her as a bridge. A small creature that walked discrete distances and knitted the edges of the neighborhood together. That's when the pattern shifted. Maggie had always been gone for a day, sometimes 2, at most. The kitten box was safe on the step. She would come back, retracting into her human-made life like an echoed tide. But one week in late winter, after a night of wind that smacked the building with a thin, brittle force, she did not return on schedule. One morning passed, then a second. By the third morning, the kittens were restless. Tiny mouths begged in, higher pitches. Their little bodies buzzed with need. He felt panic pool in his gut like a small, angry insect. He walked the blocks. He asked the woman 2 doors down if she had seen Maggie. She shook her head and gave him a flask of tea. The neighbors shrugged. The market vendor next to the corner heard the name of the cat and then laughed softly. "She walked through my stall last week like she paid rent," the vendor said, and then went back to arranging oranges. People knew her in the circling way humans know city birds, by sight, by story. His worry keened. He called out for her in the stairwell like someone calling for a person. He stood on the step and listened for the small sound of paws against concrete. He waited until his phone was dark and the building quieted in a different kind of way. He sat with the kittens and tried to soothe them. They squirmed and clambered and fell back into sleep, bewildered. On the 4th morning, he found one of the kittens at the edge of the blanket, a slick smear of something dark on its muzzle. It was not blood. It smelled like milk and metal and bathroom soap. He palmed his face and whispered a bad word to a building that had no ears. He checked again. The box lid was cocked open and the towel beneath it had been shifted as if by curious paws. Then the single thing he dreaded. A trackway of small paw prints led away from the stairwell downward toward the back gate. They were not just prints. Someone, perhaps in the night, had dragged a small smear of wetness, a trail of whatever the kitten had on it. He followed the prints into the alley like an animal following its mate's scent. The world contracted again. He felt the old tautness in his throat that had come for him like a creditor. He pushed through the back lot. At the far end of the lot, near the chain link that separated 2 buildings, there was a torn scrap of fabric snagged on a nail. It wasn't from any of his towels. It was cloth from something else. He picked it up, with a pair of trembling fingers. On the scrap, there was a smear of some cheap perfume. It made his stomach drop. He retraced his steps and then found something else. A scrap of paper folded small, tucked under a stone like a secret note. He opened it. Inside was a child's handwriting, a loop and a stop. Mammy, Maggie. The paper smelled faintly of crayons and the sweet tang of spilled juice. The sight of the letters made his mouth dry as dust. When he returned to the stairwell, the kittens were louder. The box seemed too small for the sound. He felt both fury and a childish hope that somehow she had gone to fetch help. He called again, voice raw now, and the corridor answered with the clink of pipes. People told him different things. A teenager in the building remembered seeing a woman he didn't recognize with Maggie in her arms. She had spoken to the cat in a manner that suggested familiarity. A neighbor on the 3rd floor swore Maggie had been hit by a car 2 days prior. Another thought maybe she had simply decided to take her brood somewhere else. None of the theories settled his chest. All of them were evidence that Maggie had a life he didn't own. He tried to stay practical. He texted the local shelters. He called a neighborhood forum and posted a picture. In the digital age, giving a creature a new name is as simple as scattering a silhouette across 1,000 idle screens. People offered advice, condolence, a few insults toward unknown offenders. Some wrote back with maps of their own sightings. Saw a tabby near the laundromat. I think I saw her by the park. The messages were both balm and salt. They made him feel connected and excruciatingly alone. On the 6th night, almost a week since her absence, he decided to wait in the dark outside the window of the building she had been seen near. He wrapped himself in a coat that smelled of his own breath and stood like a ghost that would not be noticed. The park lights threw pale islands onto the sidewalk. He had learned in 3 weeks how to be still. He had learned to let his heartbeat demur to the rhythm of street life. Near midnight, he heard a sound that made his bones remember why he had made this life in the first place. A faint scratching at the window of the little flat that had been bright before. A child's voice, half asleep, called, "Maggie?" The sound sunk in. It broke something inside him and reassembled it. He had to move quickly, yet gently, the way you rescue a child from a fever dream. He approached the door. It was slightly ajar. Light breathed out. The smell of fried onions and perfume and toy plastic drifted toward him. He could see inside in the thin slice offered by a hall. The room contained small furniture and a bed with a cover patterned in daisies. There were drawings taped to the wall. A small pile of detergent-scented laundry lay on a chair. It was the kind of room that promised a person. It promised hands. He hovered in the frame. Inside, a woman he hadn't seen before knelt with a child. The child clutched a stuffed elephant and held out a hand. "Maggie," the child breathed. "Where did you go?" He saw Maggie in the child's arms, tucked like a secret. The cat's eyes were distant, glazed with the sheen of a creature stretched thin. One ear bore a new scab, a thin pink line where fur had been rubbed away. There was a faint odor of soap on her. Her belly did not look quite the same. It was fuller and lower, and he realized with a cold jolt that perhaps she had been nursing elsewhere, or been taken in to better care. The woman looked up. Her face had the map of someone who had fixed their own life around small, necessary acts. She spoke in a voice that was cautious and then warm. "She keeps visiting," she said to no one in particular. "She waits at the door sometimes. She brings my son toys." She laughed softly and then fell quiet. Her laugh had the timbre of someone who knew the cost of small kindnesses. He could have stepped in. He could have knocked and demanded to know the particulars, but the thing that stopped him was the sight of Maggie's pupils contracting, tracking his inching shadow. The cat's body stiffened in a way that made something clench in him. For a blade of a second, he felt like an intruder in a scene that included him by accident. Then the child looked up straight at him. "Are you the man?" the child asked, small voice bright. It was as if the child already knew in some thread of small human logic that people who keep doors open to cats are the sort of people you can talk to. He had no time to think. The woman smiled at the child, and then at him. "She keeps coming," she said again, explaining nothing but offering everything in the same breath. "She likes to bring gifts. Her name is Maggie." He opened his mouth. He wanted to say, "She's mine." He wanted to say, "I was there." He wanted to say, "She slept under my door while she had her babies." Instead, the words that came were smaller. The kittens. She had kittens. The woman's face changed then. She had not known. The child's eyes widened, big as little moons. The woman moved with the slow quickness of someone who has to reorder the world around an unexpected fact. She bent and peered at the cat's belly, then reached out, careful, and stroked the line where fur met warmth. "Maybe she has more," she said, tone suddenly practical, like a midwife who smells the work of life. "Maybe she's hiding them. Maybe she's gone to check somewhere else." She looked at him then, and there was understanding in that glance. It carried no accusation. It carried only the flat fact that roads in the city are crooked. "She brings things," the woman added. "Small things. She likes us. She likes you. She likes being between." Between. The word lodged in his chest. It was the precise description of Maggie's life. She had chosen not one home, but the margins between doors. She threaded herself where people were most likely to look away. She had the behavior of someone who kept her options, safety as a network rather than a single shelter. He stepped forward then, feeling like a trespasser in an alley whose map he had not been given. The child held out a small plastic soldier. "For your kittens," he said, solemn as a priest. The soldier was dented and a bit of paint flaked at its elbow. Maggie sniffed it, then dropped it on the floor like an offering returned. She glanced at him and then toward the stairwell as if asking whether this was the moment she should go back. The woman looked at him with eyes that had already seen enough small, exquisite needs to be careful with the word, help. "You were at her door?" she asked. "Yes," he said. I've been looking after them." She nodded slowly. folding a thought like linen. Then keep watching. We will ask around. Maybe someone will take them. Maybe we can find a vet. She lets us touch her sometimes. She's particular. Her smile was small but honest. She has more than one family, she said, as if it was the most normal thing in the world. They spoke until the neighborly light thinned. They swapped small pieces of information like currency. The woman's son slept eventually, and Maggie settled on the child's blanket like a bookmark. He left feeling both relieved and raw. Relief because Maggie was safe, for now. Raw because the map of her life included rooms he was not part of. The next morning she didn't come back to his door. Instead, a note appeared in the morning slip of his mailbox. It was from the woman. Maggie visited again last night, it read in the neat, decisive loop of handwriting. She seemed unsure. She left a button and something else. We will keep an eye on her. If you see her with the kittens, please call. There was a phone number. Below it she had written, "She will always come back sometimes, don't panic. R." He folded the note and slid it into his pocket like a small talisman. He sat on the step and watched the light shift over the blanket. The kittens fed, squealed, and slept. The day pressed itself into them, and then the evening came with its own kind of hunger. That night, he waited in his usual place. Midnight arrived and the building settled into the kind of quiet that holds secrets like it is trying not to wake them. His watchfulness had become a thing he carried around inside himself now. He was not sure whether he had built a life or confessed to one. At 1 a.m., there was a sound he could not place. It was like a tiny argument, a mew, and then another mew, and then a sound like the scraping of furniture. He snapped to his feet and swung the door wide. The stairwell was empty. The blanket lay in a heap. The box sat on its side, the kittens, scrambling in panic, their tiny mouths pushing against air. The hair in the back of his neck rose. He scanned the corridor. It led to the left and then the left again. He followed the sound like someone following a memory until he found the neighbor's door wide and the hallway from inside lit with a glow. The woman's voice called, high and sharp with the peculiar lilt of alarm. "Maggie! No! Maggie, come here now!" It was different from the night before. It carried an urgency that pricked at him. He stepped into the sliver of light and saw movement. A small shape darting past a doorway, a shadow threading through human legs. The woman and her child stood, bare feet planted, faces pale. The child clutched his stuffed elephant as if it might protect him from the fact of things. Before he could call an explanation, the neighbor shouted his name. "Hey, over here," she called in a voice that was both invitation and alarm. He crossed the hall in 3 long strides, and then froze at the sight. On the floor, in the open doorway, lay a tiny trembling bundle. It was not a kitten. It was a small thing wrapped in plastic, the kind of plastic used to wrap a leftover sandwich. It moved with a faint, ragged life. A small whimper came from it. The neighbor's face went gray. The child began to cry, a sound that made him feel all of his old unworked grief at once. He crouched down and moved the plastic aside. Inside was a tiny animal. He had expected mice, and the city is generous in its cruelty. But inside the plastic was a small puppy, not a cat, but a warm, wet-fibered pup, eyes not yet fully open. How it had got there he could not know. Who had left it he could not understand. The neighborhood's edges had given up another small creature to the same geography of kindness that had folded Maggie into it. Maggie appeared then, as if answered by the chaos, slipping in and landing beside the small bundle. She sniffed it, a long, incredulous investigation. She did not hiss or push it away. She brushed her body against the puppy, then looked up at him with the kind of expression that makes a human confess to any sin. Her whiskers twitched. She seemed to own, in an elemental way, the right to inspect the abandoned life and render a verdict. He picked up the puppy with gloved hands and felt the tremor of life that was too fragile for all the cheap metaphors he had lying around. Its skin smelled like wet cardboard and milk. It was warm and flappable and absurd in the way newborns are. The woman looked at him with the kind of pleading that has no words. Who would do such a thing? she asked. He had no answer. He only had a hand that offered a way to hold something together. He wrapped the puppy in the spare towel and held it as if he might stitch time with his fingers. Maggie sat at his feet and watched, her body a small, steady presence. The kittens in the box had quieted, the noise of their hunger washed away for a time by the newness of the scene. They spent the night arranging small things into a temporary rescue. They fed the pup with warmed milk and a syringe borrowed from a well-meaning neighbor with a cat that had had kittens long ago. The child's small fingers stroked Maggie's back and then fell asleep, exhausted by the emotional weather of the evening. They took shifts watching the new arrival. The city folded around them like a sleepy animal. When dawn came, the small creature slept inside a towel on the windowsill. Maggie had disappeared again. She had been in the room in the night, but come morning she was gone, and once again the seam at the door held only a small museum of things. A child's button, a smear of red paint, a cheap plastic soldier. He walked to the neighbor's apartment to thank the woman and to ask whether she had known about the pup. She shook her head and told him she found it a cruel thing someone did. But Maggie, she kept sniffing it, the woman said, almost defensively, like she was promising to be its aunt. The woman laughed, a short, brittle sound, then fell quiet. She likes to collect, she said again. She collects people. He left with more questions than answers. Maggie's life had grown more complicated than a man with a warm apartment could account for. There were rooms she visited and hands that accepted her. She walked between. She collected tokens and left them like mail. She folded herself into the hands that would accept her and then back out into the street. Now the network included a puppy and a child and the meeting points in between. He wanted to feel grateful and he wanted to feel cheated, both at once. Over the next days, the pattern snowballed. More items appeared. A tiny rubber bracelet snapped and left behind evidence of teeth, a scrap of green yarn with a knot, a tiny worn photograph of two people, edges softened by time taped carelessly to the underside of a soda can ring. The things were not violent. They were intimate. They were signs that Maggie threaded herself into lives that were themselves. Complicated. Rooming houses, small families, folks moving between jobs. The neighborhood story thickened. He tried to be useful. He drove the pup to a volunteer who knew about neonatal care. He bought a small carrier and a cheap heating pad and left it tucked behind the box for Maggie's kittens. He mailed messages to local rescue groups. He baked bread and left slices near the door like peace offerings to a complicated world. People responded in the way city people do. Some with fervor, some with indifference. A few offered fosters. One man, from 2 blocks, over-offered money for a vet if needed. The woman R left notes in his mailbox about possible adopters and the name of a cheap clinic. And then, without warning, the second shift occurred. Maggie started spending more time at the other door, the child's house. Not all nights, but more. Often than not, she would go there in the late hours and stay for long stretches. She would return weary and with a different smell in her fur, laundry and milk and someone else's bed hair scent. The frequency increased. The kitten box saw her less. Each time she went, she left one of the small items that had become her vocabulary. He began to feel left out in a way that made him ashamed. Feelings like that are not noble. They are very human. He tried to be practical about it. He told himself she had claimed both spaces. She was building redundancy, a network of shelter points. He could see the logic. But the heart wants what it wants. He wanted to be first. He wanted to be the person who had been there when the storm started. He wanted the simple, undeniable ownership that had no need for asterisk or disclaimer. It was a selfishness he recognized and tried to minimize. Then one night the pattern changed in a way that set the whole night on edge. It had rained. The weather had promised to be mild, but then decided otherwise. He had been in the apartment prepared for a late night. His phone buzzed with messages from the woman R. She had seen Maggie near the laundromat, she said. She had seen her cross into the park. Then the messages stopped. His thumb hovered over the keypad. He pulled on a jacket and went to the door. The stairwell smelled of wet plaster. His breath fogged in the air like a small token of life. He walked the route she usually took. He checked the park, the alley, the vendor stalls. Nothing. There were no other tracks left. He felt a cold wind pass through him like an accusation. He walked with the deliberate slowness one uses to avoid alerting whatever danger one believes might be hiding. He did not want anyone to see him in his domestic disarray, an adult crouching at the edge of a park bench and scanning for the shape of a cat. At the far end of the park, near the kids' play area, he found a small scrap of fabric pinned to the chain-link fence. It was not one of Maggie's trinkets. It was the flap of a blanket, the kind given to the homeless or left in bags of donations. The color was a faded blue. He picked it up and something clattered in his chest like a loose coin. There was a second scrap pinned below it. These did not belong to his towels. They were markers. He followed a trail of small indications: a toy soldier with a missing arm leaning against a tree, a single shoe near a trash bin, a smear of damp ground where a little life had rested. At the entrance to an underpass, he saw, to his stupefaction, a small, roughly made shelter of cardboard and plastic. Inside, perched like a queen on scraps, was Maggie. She was not alone. She had a second brood. There were kittens here too, smaller and thinner than the 4 he had known, sweat-sticky and scared. They looked to him, and for a second the world balanced on the tiny tilt of their ears. Maggie's eyes met his, and there was a recognition sharp as glass. She strutted forward, head high, and pushed her nose at one of her charges. The new kittens, huddled in on themselves, their ribs faintly visible in the poor light. One had a ragged ear, not by birth but by the hard work of survival. He had not expected this. In his mind there had been one litter, one small fragile collection of life that had come to rest under his door. But Maggie's universe was larger than his door. Her life contained rooms and people, and another hollow that had fed more mouths. The new nest was set in a place that had more wind and less human tender. It sat on the slatted floor of an old storage shed beneath the overpass, a place that smelled like oil and time. His chest filled with a pain that had the edges of betrayal and the center of awe. It was as if she had given him a second, surreptitious life that he had not been invited into. How long had she been caring for others? How many small lives had she threaded through the city? He crouched, silent, feeling ridiculous and enormous. He had to decide what to do. He could gather up the babies and bring them home. He could call the woman and the neighbors to help. He could leave them alone, respecting the rough wisdom of a mother who knows the landscape better than he did. He found himself thinking of the human who leaves scraps in the world and expects no thanks. He thought of a child who may have tied a ribbon to the fence for her. He thought of the woman R's neat handwriting and the way she had said Maggie had many families. He made the practical choice then. He turned and walked back to the stairwell. He needed help. The kittens that were his had to be safe. The new brood had to have warmth. He grabbed the small carrier and the extra towels and the cheap heating pad. He texted neighbors, angry or pleading texts nearly, and they came, drawn by the gravity of another life. The vendor offered a blanket. The teenager from the building offered to hold a flashlight. When they returned to the underpass, their arrival had changed the geometry of the place. The small queen, Maggie, did not hiss. Instead, she watched them with a measured distance and then seemed to weigh the possible futures. When a hand reached out, she did not flinch. Instead, she stepped into the light and allowed the neighbor to lift a kitten. The animal was tiny and damp and slug-like in its initial resistance to being held. They took the new kittens back to the stairwell in shifts. The woman R carried a small crate and hummed as if singing to an old habit. The teenager scowled but carried the towel like a soldier obeying orders. They arranged the borrowed heat lamp carefully. Maggie watched as they moved her charge into the space near the first brood. For a long, suspended minute, nothing happened. Then, as if guided by an instinct too old for them all, the two sets of kittens tentatively inspected each other. The scent of survival is complicated and full. They sniffed, squealed, and then began to feed. Maggie, imperious and still guarded, settled in between groups like a hinge, and began to clean them with an almost mechanical thoroughness. Her devotion was not a sentiment. It was work. He watched her, and the world felt both expanded and smaller. Her life traveled wider than his door. She had other rooms, other laps. She had other people who left her ribbons and buttons and the odd bracelet. She had the right to be everywhere she chose to be. He had to make space in his heart for that. The act of doing so felt like both a surrender and a real, courageous kindness. As they worked, the neighborhood congealed into a temporary rescue team. They contacted a clinic that gave them a discounted checkup. They pooled money for vaccinations. They made a schedule. In the end, the cats were not his alone. They belonged to the block, the people and the dumplings and the old ones who watched from windows. It was a messy, beautiful communal thing. At the end of the day, he sat on the step and let his forehead rest against the cool wood of the door. Maggie hopped up and rubbed the side of her head against his knee. For a moment he felt the old simple truth. You can love something and let it go. You can be both the person who cares and the person who must yield to the fact that life is not a single thread. But the pattern did not let him rest. Over the next few days, Maggie's disappearances lengthened. She began to go for longer stretches, returning exhausted, sometimes with small wounds, sometimes with new tiny trinkets no one could identify. The woman R told him she'd seen Maggie near another building on the borderline of the district, and someone else said she'd seen her near the river. The city was full of places to berth and hide, and then the cliffhanger that boiled his blood in a way only unanswered questions can. One night, after they had arranged the kittens beneath the lamp and wrapped the puppy in a towel, Maggie did not return at all. Not for a night, not for two. The small museum of her gifts still lay in the windowsill, but the mat was cold. The kittens cried with a steadier, lower whine. He sat watching them and felt the particular terror of being insufficient. On the third night, while he was out on the block handing out flyers, someone called. The woman's voice on the phone was thin. "We found something." She did not finish. He ran down the building stairs 2 steps at a time. He pushed through the small crowd that had gathered at the corner, and then stopped, because at the center of the street near the lamppost was a sight he could not reconcile. There was a small cardboard box taped shut. On top of the box, someone had placed a child's note, for Maggie. The handwriting was looped and shaky. Beneath the loop, an arrangement of small items, a chewed crayon, a single sock, a feather, had been placed like altar offerings. No one had seen who left it. The box was heavy. When they opened it, the people around him fell silent. Inside, the box tightly packed was a cluster of tiny cold bodies, not kittens, not puppies. Small newborns, their bodies slick with the indifference of abandonment. They were not moving. There was a smell that made him retch, the sharp sting of neglect. A small, inexperienced pediatric hand reached in and closed around one of the bodies, and there was a sound like someone dropping a cup. Maggie appeared then, as if drawn like a magnet to the place where the world did something unspeakable. She circled the box, sniffed, and then, without the hesitation he had grown used to, she leapt into the cardboard and began to nudge and clean. Her movements were rough and urgent. She pressed her tiny face into the space between the bodies as if trying to revive them, like a midwife trying to wake a listless ember. The scene was impossible. It made him feel everything, rage, hope, grief, in a single moment. The neighborhood sealed itself into a hush. The woman R put her hand over her mouth. The child made a sound that was not a word but a small, bright noise like glass ringing. The cardboard box, the note, the items on top, they were a language he could not interpret. Someone had left life in that box, perhaps hoping the one being who navigated the margins would rescue them. Perhaps someone had no other option. He wanted to scream at the person who did it. He wanted to blame the city. He wanted to blame himself for not doing more. But the only thing that moved was Maggie, who worked and worked, small jaw working, trying to rearrange fates by the motion of her tongue. Her focus was absolute. Her body ached. She did not look at him. She had no time for his human questions. They worked through the night. They called the clinic, they wrapped the bodies, they warmed them near the heat lamps. 2 of the newborns rallied and made small, promising noises. One was limp. One would not open its mouth. The puppies of the first. Night took to the noise with the ignorant indifference of new lives. The whole street became a temporary hospital, stitched from jackets and borrowed heat. When the first light of morning came up, painting the buildings brick pink, they had 2 warm, breathing newborns. Maggie sat under the lamp, exhausted, and, in a way that took his breath away, she lifted her head and looked straight at him. Her eyes held something like accusation and forgiveness, braided into one. She had gathered life that had nothing to do with his permits or his routines. She had done what animals do in the way the world demands. She saved what was left. He wanted to ask her where she found them. He wanted to know who could leave such small bodies in a box with a child's note on top. He wanted to understand whether she had been given to some other person with a stitched web of kindness or whether she had stolen another's children. The questions hurt to hold. The city kept its indifferent rhythm, and the people around him moved through small practicalities. But the biggest question of all, the cliffhanger that made air taste like ash, sat like a cold stone on the stair-step. Maggie did not come back for the nights that followed. Not to his door. Not for the kittens he had watched suckle and sleep. She had crossed the city and found other hearths. She had brought life into the world and dragged strangers to tenderness. She had placed offerings on doorsteps like small religious rites. She had become a courier of survival. And then she was gone. He waited each night, leaning his head against the wood and listening for the soft, steady presence he had learned to depend on. He hoped for a rattle of paws. He imagined the charity of the city's movements. He tried to be practical. He texted. He called. He walked her routes. He asked the child at the woman's house whether Maggie had returned. The child shrugged and said in the honest way children say cruel things without meaning them, "Maggie goes where she needs." On the 7th night of her absence, he heard something that prickled the fine hairs along his forearm. A noise, soft, deliberate, like the side of a paw against a metal bin. The kind of sound only a feline makes when testing the boundary of a world. He rushed to the stairwell and flung the door open. There she was at the bottom of the steps, not on the mat this time, but sitting 2 doors down, in the shadow of another hallway. She looked different, not only because of the wear on her ear or the soap scent in her fur, but because her eyes carried a message he could not yet translate. For a second, the world tilted. She stepped forward. She did not move toward his apartment. Instead, she padded past it and went straight to the other door, the one that had once been across from him, the one where the woman R lived, and her child. She slipped inside without hesitation. He had a moment to grab the sleeve of the woman's coat. He caught her wrist. "Maggie's in there," he said. His voice did not sound like his own. She looked at him, eyes tired and surprised. "She probably went to keep something safe," she said. Then in a voice that had the kind of reasoning you give to a dangerous assumption, she whispered, "Go with her. See where she goes. But be careful." He set his jaw because he knew what was coming next. This was the point where a decision had to be made. This was the slope where curiosity becomes action and action becomes consequence. He followed her into the house and through the small rooms. The child's drawings stared from the wall like witnesses. The furniture smelled like someone had used it and cared for it with a small fidelity he envied. They went inside, and then the door closed behind them and the world narrowed to a single hallway and a sound, like a tiny mew, from deeper inside. He had never intended to trespass so fully into the map of another life. But the city had different plans for him now, and as he moved forward, he felt the pull of something waiting to be revealed, like a breath held in the lungs of the night. He felt the shape of consequences settle into his bones. He stepped into the next room, and the door behind him clicked shut. He stepped into the room, and the world narrowed to a few breaths. The door clicked shut behind him. A small, human sound that felt like permission and a sentence at the same time. The house was warm Warm in the way a kettle is warm, in the way a child's body makes its own weather. The light inside was soft and patched with the color of the curtains. There were pictures on the wall, crooked, taped with the kind of faith that says, tomorrow will be better, and drawings with suns and stick figures taped above the low sofa. The air smelled of detergent and onions and the faint, sticky sweetness of jam. It smelled like a life where someone tried. He had expected the scene to be quick. He had imagined, in the private movie theater of his head, a tidy confession. Maggie would be here. He would ask questions. Answers would be given. He would leave with his dignity bruised but with knowledge. Instead, the house unfolded like paper. It contained more rooms. It contained hallways that led to a kitchen that had a small table and under the table a cardboard carrier with a towel. It contained a small closet door ajar, and behind that closet, the thing he would remember for a long time. He counted his reactions on his fingers like a child learning multiplication. First, the sound. A thin, insistent noise. Not a pure mew. Not a cry the kittens had made. Something like a rasp of small mouths. He had heard it before in his stairwell. A promise of need. But here it was layered, multiplied. It made his throat ache. Second, the heat. The closet was a small oven of breath. Towels draped and trapped warmth. The light from a tiny lamp turned every small movement into a small epic. Third, the smell that hit him and made his eyes sting. The heavy, wet scent of milk and the faint chemical tang of antiseptic. It was the smell of people who had been up all night, the smell of small lives being held together with the things at hand. He pushed the closet door wider and crouched. There, pressed into a nest of towels and a soft bed, were kittens. Not just the ones he had known. More. A whole, blinking clutch of them, tucked together like a small constellation. Their eyes had just opened. Their fur was the color of dust, and the stripes that made Maggie a tabby were present in miniature. Some had odd markings, a white sock, a speckled face, a little black patch like a bell. They were small enough that a hand could lay across half a body and still not touch them all. Maggie sat in the doorway of the closet like a sentinel. Her sides heaved with the business of lactation and motion. She looked ragged in a way that made his breath shallow. Her ear bore a new scar, a pale crescent. She had a dried smear on her flank where a fight or rush had left its mark. Her eyes, however, were the thing that made him stop being merely a man with a problem to solve. They were large, steady, and full of a river-deep knowing. In them was the look of someone who had been sent out into a world to collect what the world would not keep. The woman who lived there, the one who'd answered him in the door, straightened from folding a towel. Her face had the small, tired wrinkles of a person who had been given too many things to manage. She saw him see the kittens, and for a second she closed her mouth like a person who wanted to say something that would not be a promise she could not keep. "I thought she belonged to you," she said, because she had to say something to shape the space. He wanted to say yes. He wanted to say no. He wanted to say both. Instead, he said the simplest truth he could manage. "She had kittens under my door." The sentence felt small and enormous at once. She nodded. "She's been coming here for months," she said. "She sleeps on my son's bed sometimes. She brings little things. We call her ours, and then she goes. She knows too much to be kept." Her voice was practical, like someone reciting fact. Then she laughed, a soft, private sound that had no mirth in it. "She's a cat with many families." Blinked. It was the phrase that should have been obvious and had never landed. A cat with many families. He had imagined property. He had imagined a single heart that needed to be claimed. Instead, Maggie had built a net, a city-sized safety net stitched from small acts. He wanted to understand every stitch in that net. He followed his questions like, a child trailing kitchen crumbs, how many nests, how many doors? Why would she leave the kittens in a closet here, with space that smelled like breakfast and detergent and children? Had she brought them here because it was warmer? Because she knew human hands here were kind? Had she done it because the stairwell, For all his anxious tending was still too exposed for newborns. The answers came in fragments. The woman, R, as her notes had signed, told him a clipped history. "I work nights," she said. Her hands were quick and sure. "Afternoons. I watch my sister's kids. They need someone around. Maggie knows this. She brings things to us, often small things that belong to the neighbors. Buttons, crayons, the odd earring. My son thinks she's a magician. Once she came in with a postcard from the laundromat." She shrugged. "She's been dropping off these babies here for the last week. She goes and comes like the tide. Sometimes she leaves the kittens at other places, too. A woman under the bridge, an old man who lives behind the tailor, she's coordinating. Coordinating." The word hit him like a bell. He had been narrating possession the way lonely people narrate the world. Maggie had been practicing a more complicated ethics. She had not been choosing him because she wanted to belong to him. She had been choosing him because she was someone who threaded safety like a surgeon stitches a wound, wherever the tissue was soft enough to hold. He felt the room tilt. The small moral calculus he had been doing in the months since she'd come had been about him. But the truth, the one that made his hands tremble, was larger. Maggie was not the problem of his loneliness. She was a solution to the street's negligence. She was a courier of care. She had learned the map of the block. She knew which doors opened to warmth at different hours. She had learned human rhythms and folded herself into them. He crouched lower and rested his palm on the closet doorframe. One of the kittens opened its mouth in a small, oxygen-starved moan. The sound braided around his throat and loosened something he had been holding for years. He had, for a long time, been folding his life around the idea that being careful meant being solitary. He had been wrong. Maggie had shown him that careful could mean communal. Then he saw the note pinned to the wall, half behind a child's drawing. It was tiny, barely legible. The kind of scrawl you get when you are moving and need to remember where you put something. It read, "For Maggie, don't take too many. Love, M." The M was a child's loop, and it broke his heart. The woman told him quickly, "A lot of these people don't have much. They do what they can. Sometimes they leave things for Maggie to bring to others. She redistributes. She's like a mail carrier with fur. Yesterday I found a sock taped to the stairwell. Today it was a button in the closet. She has favorites. She saved this place for kittens because we have towels and my kids' room is warm. Maggie trusts these rooms." Understanding settled in him like a new coat. It fit awkwardly at first. It smelled faintly of other people's laundry. It made him uneasy and grateful at the same time. He realized how small his earlier ownership had been. He had thought to hold a life single-handedly, as though that were the right thing. Here was evidence that life in the city required a web of hands. A single person, no matter how steady, could not be everything. Maggie had known it. She had been building redundancy out of scraps. As the woman spoke, Maggie moved. She stepped out from the closet and padded to his feet. For the first time since he had known her intimately, since the first night on the threshold, she did not hesitate. She looked up at him. Her pupils narrowed and she pressed the side of her face into his ankle like one who tucks a note into a hand. The gesture was small and absolute. He sank to his knees without thinking. Her head fit into his palm the way a patch fits a torn sweater. Her fur was still faintly oily with the city. Her cheek had a dried smear of something. Milk? Jam? And he wiped it with a finger and felt tears sting his eyes. His hands shook. It was not simply that she allowed the touch. It was that she had for weeks been telling him something with the careful grammar of gifts, and now she gave the clearest. Punctuation, "I trust you." It was the cat's unmistakable gesture of love. The animal pressed her forehead against his palm and made a small vibrating sound. It was a purr, but more like a hum that belonged to mechanics and resolve. He felt the sound in his chest. He let the tears come because there was no dignity in holding back in front of a cat that had been brave enough to build a community. There was something else that he noticed in that contact. Maggie's spine quivered with exhaustion. She was caring for other lives like a small overworked midwife. She had been taking wounds home with her. She had been wearing the city like a coat, and sometimes the coat had been torn. He lifted his face and looked at her. She looked back as if saying with a single feline sentence, "You are part of this now, not owner, not hero. A node, a hand in a network." She held his stare and did not blink in the way she often had. It was a deliberate, human-like insistence. She was inviting him to understand the code by which she lived. He understood in a way that felt like being given a map, whose legend he had been missing all along. The decisions he had made, the bowls, the blanket, the lamp, were not acts of ownership. They were ways to shore up a small network. They were thread. They gave her options. That was the trust she was offering, not to be possessed but to be relied upon. His breathing came in sharp, uncertain pulls. He realized the scale of the problem. The kittens needed help beyond towels and lamps if they were to survive. All his carefulness would not be enough. He had to act. And yet before he could plan anything, his body moved with automatic kindness. He reached for the smallest kitten and held it. It fit in his palm like a secret. Its heartbeat was a quick drum. Its fur stuck to his fingers. He felt his hands tremble as he cradled the small life. The woman brought a bottle with warmed milk and an ambidextrous syringe. She guided his hands with a practiced, blunt tenderness. "Tilt," she said. "Not too much, just enough so they can swallow." He followed as if he had been told to, do this all his life. The kitten sucked like an honest thing. Its belly filled and the vibration of contentment started up like a small engine in miniature. He fed until his arms cramped and his mouth was dry. 2 other kittens had snuggled into the crook of the towels and were beginning to sleep. The small heat lamp cast a halo over everything, making the room look like the inside of a watch. The woman made coffee and offered him a mug. He took it, hands still smelling faintly of kitten, and drank the bitter liquid like a sacrament. As practicalities arranged themselves, the vet call, the neighbor who could foster once the kittens were stable, the paper towels and kitten formula, the human in him shifted into a new job. He was no longer a man keeping a cat company. He had become part of an emergency response. The city had taught him this in other contexts, shaken him through crises, but never so tenderly. He felt a humility then that was almost painful. He had been given a second chance not because he was chosen, but because he was present. The woman told him more backstory in fragments between errands. "There are folks who feed her," she said. "An old tailor leaves scraps. A boy who sleeps under the bridge once fed her a sandwich. A woman in a hostel gave her a blanket. Maggie took care of them when they needed her. She has been a courier of comfort." She paused and laughed softly. "And she likes to collect things. Maybe because things have history on them. She brings them back to show she's been places." He thought about the items he'd found on his mat. The button, the crayon, the bent earring. Each was now more than a curiosity. Each was an index of people who lived in the seams. Maggie had been collecting traces and bringing them to other traces so that no one was completely without. Then the woman looked at him, steady and real. "She trusts people who are kind when it matters," she said. "You put out a bowl and a blanket. That's how she knows you can be a place for a life." Her tone was more direct than he expected. It felt like a teacher calling a student close. "If you want to help, you will need to think bigger than your door." The realization was an ember that became a plan. He saw now that his previous acts, the blanket, the bowls, the small watchfulness, were necessary but not sufficient. If Maggie's network was to hold, it needed more hands, more food, more vet visits, more logistics. He could mobilize what he could. He could call the small clinic that offered sliding scale services. He could post in the neighborhood group that he would coordinate fosters. He could swim in the muddy waters of community rescue. The scale of it made him dizzy and, strangely, alive. But before action came a quieter, more urgent thing. He needed to understand finally why Maggie had left the kittens in closets, in cardboard boxes, in underpasses. He needed to forgive himself for thinking she had betrayed him by going to other doors. He needed to accept the cat's code and take his place in it. He knelt again and pressed his forehead against Maggie's head. She did not move. She breathed and let him be. Her purr was a small, steady thing that vibrated the floorboards. He placed his palm on her spine and felt the tiny motion of milk and adrenaline. He felt the map of the block in the roughness of her fur. He understood, in a way that no speech could make sharper, what she had been trying to say with her gifts and departures. I will keep moving. I will look for warm rooms. I will weave people together. Trust that you are one of the rooms. The cat's gesture, pressing into him, staying, was the element that broke his chest and rebuilt it more whole. With that press, she had given him not ownership but instruction. He was to be a contributor. Not a collector, not a rescuer who hoarded. A node. He let the thought sit there and turn in him. It was humbling, delightful, hard. He felt like a beginner learning a new language with words he would never have guessed existed. Mutuality, redundancy, network. He had spent years building walls. Now he saw the virtue in scaffolding. They worked together then, with an unglamorous efficiency. He called clinics. He moved money from a week's budget into a fund for shots and neuters. He scrounged a carrier from a friend and paid for small, essential things. The neighbors rallied in the way neighborhoods will when someone shows them. A live thing held together by towels. The vendor who sold oranges donated a box. The teenager from the building agreed to keep a gurney-like towel-wrapped kitten overnight. The woman R offered to foster one until the kitten could go to a more permanent home. When twilight arrived, the closet nursery was full and humming. 2 kittens slept in his jacket pocket like heavy coins. 2 others dozed under the lamp. Maggie sprawled across his shoes and left the slow print of a purr on his veins. The room smelled like milk and life and the faint dust of the street. He had not expected to be so tired. He had not expected to be so full. Hours later, when the city had softened to a small, distant hum, and when he walked out into the stairwell with a box of supplies under his arm, Maggie followed. She padded alongside him like a small, stately guardian. When he reached the threshold of his own door, she paused, as she always had, just outside. He crouched and put his hand out. She came and pressed the side of her face into his palm. She pressed as if she might tuck a little of her courage into him. She stayed against his hand for a beat that felt like an epoch. Then, with the quiet of a thing that understands limits, she turned and padded away toward the other door across the hall. He watched her go and felt something congeal behind his ribs. He had wanted, in the private rooms of his mind, to build a simple tale of rescue. Man saves cat, cat becomes pet, life softens. Instead, he had been made to expand. He had been asked to move from possession to participation. The difference felt like a revelation that rearranged furniture. When the door closed behind Maggie in the other hallway, he whispered without theatrics, not like a command, but like an agreement. We'll do it together. Maggie, who had spent the night threading together the lives of the street, returned the simplest human gift she could. She lifted her face and met his eyes. There was no grand speech. There was the small, raw truth that lives in the look between a person and an animal when both have been honest. And at that moment, he finally understood what she had been trying to tell him in the first nights. That trust is not a knot to tie someone down. It is a rope to be shared. It does not mean you own someone's heart. It means you are one of the hands on the rope when things go wrong. He let that knowledge sit in the hollow under his sternum. It fit like a new cavity. It made room. The lamp in the closet hummed as if in agreement. The kittens breathed in the slow rhythm of the safe. He closed his door and walked slowly to his kitchen, where a kettle hissed like a small animal. He put his palm to the metal and felt its warmth. He thought of the list he would write in the morning: vets, fosters, supplies. He thought of the people who had already offered to help. He thought of Maggie's small, tireless migrations across the block. He had been given a choice, and he had made it without fuss. He would be part of the net. He would change the measure of his life to accommodate the weather of other lives. It would be harder than the solitary plan he had once conceived. It would cost money and time and comfort. It would require him to soften. He welcomed the cost. Maggie came back later that night and curled at the base of his door. She breathed the air of the stairwell as if taking a compass reading. She twitched her whiskers and made a small, satisfied sound. She slept, and in that sleep she let the world know she trusted him. He lay awake for a long time, listening to her breath. He felt less alone, and in that less aloneness, there was an ache that was all right. It was the ache of belonging to something larger than the scope of his own life. When finally he fell asleep, it was heavy and honest and oddly generous. He dreamed of maps, not of places but of hands, people's hands, connected by a furred courier who had taught him how to be part of a network. And in the closing moment before the story tilted into the next day, he pressed his hand to his chest and remembered the small, beating lesson Maggie had offered with every departure and return. Trust is a practice, not a possession. He understood at last what she had been trying to tell him all along. The city learned to hold its breath differently after that winter. The first light of spring came in a thin, cautious way. It slid across the stairwell like a hand testing the temperature of a cup. The kittens grew with the stubbornness of things made to live. Their eyes cleared. Their legs found a better geometry. Their squeals became purposeful. Their mouths learned the rhythm of suckling and then of trying solid things. They bit at towels. They toppled over each other. They fell asleep in a pile, like a small, warm loaf. He watched them, often without thinking. He found a place for his hands in their lives. He made micro-appointments with himself. Feed at dawn, check the lamp, sweep the step before he left. The daily acts stacked into a scaffold. The scaffold held him up. It held them too. The block rallied in small, practical ways. The vendor donated a bag of rice and a crushed tin of cat food. The teenager from the building took a night shift because his part-time job left him idle at odd hours. The woman R arranged a low-cost vet visit and drove 3 kittens in the back of her old hatchback. The old tailor stitched a small carrier with a patchwork of donated fabric. The landlord, who had once been indifferent to the stairwell's other inhabitants, was persuaded, by the quiet pressure of neighbors and the sight of a sleeping kitten caught on the windowsill, to fix the broken awning so the rain wouldn't seep into their little refuge. He learned to do cashier math he had never practiced. Vet bills were not heroic sums when paid in installments. Vaccinations, deworming, a check for the smallest one who had a cough. He discovered he could call in favors. He discovered how much people wanted to help when someone handed them a map and a role. Maggie was always at the core of the choreography. She came and went with the dignity of weather. She had become the city's stray midwife and its small furry diplomat. She would appear at unexpected hours with new tokens. One day it was a small milk-stained receipt tucked under the blanket. Another day it was a hair clip bent and golden. She never lingered long inside apartments. She preferred to be the one who moved, like a current. Sometimes he would find her perched on his windowsill in the afternoon, eyes half-lidded, a geometry of contentment and watchfulness. Other times he would not see her for 3 days and his chest would hollow in the way old losses know how to hollow. He began to notice small changes in himself. He stopped dreading his phone ring. He started returning calls he had been avoiding. He cooked meals that were more than reheated plans. He bought better coffee. He answered an email from his sister that had sat folded like a letter in his inbox for months. The woman on the other end wrote back and said, in a sentence that made the room smell of fresh laundry, "You sound better." He put the phone down and watched the light on the stairs and felt the word better move through him like a thaw. The relationship with his mother, frayed as it had been, found small stitches. He made the uncomfortable drive to the hospital one Saturday. He sat in a chair with vinyl sticking to his knees and read to her from a book she hadn't asked for. He brought photos of the kittens on his phone and watched as the corners of her lips lifted in ways small but true. She asked about Maggie, and for a while the conversation was about the cat who knew how to find rooms. It was not an enormous reconciliation. Reconciliations are rarely dramatic. They are small gestures repeated, a phone call, a visit, a cup of tea. The cat had become a reason to begin again. At work he noticed a softening of edges. He graded papers. He still scolded. In the classroom when a student cut corners. But he also found himself listening more, giving margin when a student's hand was slow to rise. He would tell them, sometimes, about trust. He would not use Maggie's name in class. It was private, but he used the lesson about networks, about how to lean on more hands when the load is too big, as if his job required him now to do more than teach math. It required him to model small moral acts. The kittens, one by one, found temporary homes. A young couple who had recently moved into the building took two. They named them Mango and Dot. The teenager who had carried a towel gave one a teenager's name and kept it in his room, Instagrammed and proud. The little shelter across the river took two and promised to look for permanent families. The last one, the runt, the one with the faintest white stripe on its chest, hung between choices. He had a soft spot for the runt. It had looked at him with an ancient, unblinking look once, and he had felt something like claim. Maggie watched each adoption with a feline distance. She would sit by the step and watch as hands lifted carriers away. Sometimes she would follow to the door, and then, like a small, sad judge, she would step back as if the court had made the decision and she must honor it. She didn't seem to grieve the same way humans do. She had a broader palate. She had a life that couriered love. She did not hoard it. On the day the runt remained, unable to find a foster who could keep it long term, something small and decisive happened. The runt, which he had been semi-jokingly calling quiet in his notebook because it slept so heavily, crawled up into his coat and fell asleep against his chest while he sat on the step, watching the street. The act was small and immediate. It felt like a weather pattern changing. The kitten chose him. It was not a grand adoption. There was no legal paper. There was only the soft weight of a living thing deciding his lap was a place to rest. The choice felt like a benediction. He brought the kitten's paperwork home and tucked it into a drawer, like a promise. He bought a proper carrier the next day. He named the kitten Ledger, because his notebook had been for months the ledger of small mercies. Ledger slept next to his pillow the first night, a tiny sponge of breathing. He woke with a small face in the corner of his eye, one paw, unfolded like a question. Ledger's purr was a mechanical thing at first, but within weeks it was a sound that made him feel the world was tolerable. He would pet Ledger at odd moments and felt his life pull into a more gentle line. Maggie's final gift was not a kitten. It was something quieter and larger. The string of small objects she brought ceased to be a mystery. They were a map. He learned from the woman R and from quiet conversations on stoops how the little things connected neighborhoods, who left the toy soldier and which building had lost a button. He learned the names behind the sewn edges. He learned, with the reverence of a slow student, that this city held more hands willing to help than he had believed. There was a night when he found an envelope tucked under his doormat. He should have known Maggie had something planned. The envelope was heavy with carefulness. Inside it, in his handwriting of being human to strangers, were notes from the neighbors, names and phone numbers of people who could take kittens temporarily, the number of a vet that offered a sliding scale, the key to a plan. Someone had typed instructions for feeding schedules. Someone else had tucked in a list of emergency clinics and a small cash donation. He traced the corner of the paper with a finger and felt as if a new hand had filled his own. It was, in a way, the final gift. A network that had learned how to hold life. Maggie had been the messenger. She had not been the whole of the work. She had been the one who pointed him toward it. The envelope was the physical proof that the block had changed the way it saw itself. Their lives adjusted. The apartment smelled now of cat shampoo and lemon. He put a little bowl near his kitchen window and watched Ledger practice the aerobics of cat life. Leap, miss, reroute. He would come home from an evening of student essays and find Maggie on the sill in a wet patch of late light, turning her body toward the sun. She was there often enough that he stopped measuring his days by whether she had shown and started measuring by the rhythms of feeding and vet checkups. Maggie never became a lap cat. She was not that kind of domestic miracle. She remained a thing of itinerant gravity. She came when she wanted. She left when duty called. She let him touch her when she chose. She remained, beautifully herself. That was the lesson he had to relearn again and again. Love is not a demand. It is a set of agreements, imperfect and shifting. One afternoon, months into the soft after, he found a ribbon tucked into the corner of his notebook. It was the same blue ribbon he had once found on her coat. He did not know who had left it. He did not care. He slid it into his pocket, like a talisman, and kept walking. It felt like a benediction. The greater gift had been the change in his interior weather. Nights were no longer an endless, empty replay. He had someone to warm his feet. He had someone whose breathing set a meter for his calm. He had new friends, odd and humane. The vendor who taught him how to fix a cheap heating lamp, the teenager who sent him snapshots of Ledger sleeping in a hoodie, the woman R who baked him an awkward loaf of bread and sat on the step, while they both watched a cat grooming herself. He learned to forgive himself in small ways. He forgave himself for not being a better son. He forgave himself for mistakes made in years when he thought not to need others. He forgave because he had been given the opportunity to act. Forgiveness, he discovered, is not a feeling that arrives fully formed. It arrives in small acts repeated, calling when you say you will, visiting when you promise, keeping a bowl filled. Winter came again, and with it the habit of vigilance returned like a tide. The city, however, had learned a different language. The landlord put up a little sign asking people to report injured animals. Someone installed a small lockbox where neighbors could drop donations for food. The woman R organized a weekend clinic at the community center. He volunteered. He handled paperwork. He learned how to hold nervous hands and scribble names on forms. Maggie watched all of this with the inscrutable face of a creature who knows the heart of the city better than its human residents. She would appear at the clinic and sit near the reception, her head lifted as if taking notes. People laughed then in that private, contented way. They began to say things like, "Maggie did well today," as if she had passed an exam. There was a final scene he carried for a long time. One late spring morning, he came home to find Ledger seated on the top of the stairwell railing, tail flicking like a metronome. Maggie sat below, looking up as if consulting with the small sovereign. The kitten leapt down and bumped his side. Maggie pressed her head to his shin, then turned and walked away down the hall. He watched her go and felt a complex, quiet pride. She had taught him to be part of a web. She had given him a kitten. She had stitched neighbors into a plan. Her gift was not exactly one thing. It was a succession of little mercies strung into a necklace. He wore it like a habit now, the habit of being useful, of being kind. Time, as it does, moved on. The kittens found confirmed homes. Ledger grew into a cat with a long, deliberate stretch. He learned to sleep with his feet under Ledger's tail, so the cat's twitch would be the last thing he felt before sleep. He took to texting the woman R with updates and small jokes. She sent meme images of cats wearing tiny crowns, their lives threaded together by fur and cardboard boxes and shared worry. Felt like a small miracle made of habitual kindness. He learned to move through grief differently, too. When a student failed to show up for a crucial test, he would write an email that asked if they were okay rather than punishing. When his mother's condition worsened for a while, he would find that the act of going to the hospital and bringing a photo of Ledger made the hallways less frightening. The cat became currency for conversation. People asked, and then they shared. One clear evening, after a long day of grading and a shorter day of worrying, he sat on the stair-step as the light thinned. Ledger slept in his lap, a warm, living thing. Maggie appeared as a wisp of a shadow and hopped up onto the rail with an ease that made him smile. She looked at him with the old, steady eyes. He felt the known lesson sweep through him again. Trust is practice. It is something you do daily. It is not always reciprocated in the way you expect. Sometimes it bounces back in the form of new responsibilities. Sometimes it glitters as a ribbon on a doorstep. Maggie reached up and, with the small, jeweler's precision cats possess, she pressed her head into his palm. It was the same gesture she had once offered on a rainy night. It was neither demand nor surrender. It was an offer. He took it. His hand rested on her head, and he let his breath slow. He felt entire in a new geometry. Years in the city teach a person to measure small things with long attention. When love and trouble both come in increments, the habit a person keeps becomes the thing that lasts. He had found that habit now. To set bowls, to fix lamps, to call a vet, to hold a frightened hand. His life rearranged itself around the steady, tiny mercies of a community that had learned to be present for one another. In those moments when Ledger purred and Maggie nudged, he thought about the kind of stories that make a person stop. Not the loud ones, not the dramatic, the soft ones, the ones that land like a finger on the pulse and say, "Here you are." He thought about how often the world demands performance and how rarely it rewards quiet constancy. He felt grateful that a cat with curving stripes had taught him the worth of being constant. And then, in a last small extraordinary switch, Maggie did something that sealed the whole change. It was not a dramatic act. It was a tiny, deliberate thing. He had been late home one night. Ledger was waiting on the stair when he opened the door, a small living welcome. Maggie was not there. He set his bag down and noticed, tucked into the hem of his coat where he always placed his keys, a small blue ribbon looped and knotted, the exact color of the ribbon he had found months before. It was impossibly precise. He had no idea when she had slipped it there. He had no idea if she had noticed something she wanted him to know. He simply found it, and for a second the world aligned like a map with its place names restored. He held the ribbon between his finger and thumb like something sacred. It was the final, unshowy gift. She had given him a token of belonging. She had not given herself. She had not renounced her wanderings. But she had offered him evidence that he belonged in whatever constellation she had set up. It was a simple gesture. It was everything. He kept the ribbon in his notebook between pages that cataloged the small daily things he no longer wanted to lose. He wrote in his ledger less often now. He did not need to record every tiny increment. He already felt them. He breathed them. He lived them. People on the block began to tell the story the way people in cities tell stories now, with small, reverent pride at the corner store, with the tilt of a head at the laundromat. Sometimes the story was slightly different. Sometimes the kitten, names changed. Sometimes the vendor claimed credit for a rescue he did not quite remember. The truth was that the story belonged to all of them now. On warm evenings, they would sit on the stoop and watch the world fold into itself. The children kicked a ball, the vendor stacked crates, the woman R handed out slices of stale bread, and the neighbors shared a laugh that made the building sound less like a place and more like a home. In the center of that life, Maggie moved like a small living compass. She threaded the hands together with the cunning of 10,000 tiny map makers. And he found he could breathe easier. Not because everything had been fixed. Life kept handing him tests. His mother's health still had hard days. Work had deadlines. The world remained a place that could wound. But the small net held more than it had when the cat first came to his step. The net made pain manageable. The net made it possible to shoulder burdens without being crushed by them. That is the last gift, he realized. A life made softer. Not because the world stopped being hard, but because in the pattern of daily care, he learned how to carry what he could and pass the rest on. He found himself learning new math. The sum of small acts multiplied by many hands grows larger than a single dramatic sacrifice. He used the idea in the classroom. He told a student who was late for an exam that there was always a way to make things right if you ask, and then taught the problem on the board. Late that night, when the building was wrapped in its ordinary hush, he sat at his window with Ledger asleep against his forearm. He thought of the nights when the rain had kept both of them company. He thought of the way a stray cat had rearranged the geometry of his life, asking nothing in exchange but presence and a small allowance of room. He placed his hand to his chest and felt the shift of a heart that had learned to be held by others and to hold others in turn. And then, as if to close the circle with a quiet, unadorned finality, he read a small note that had been slipped under his door, in handwriting that made the shape of gratitude. Thank you for being one of Maggie's rooms. It was unsigned. It didn't need a name. He smiled then, the kind of smile that has no audience, just the permission it gives itself. He looked to the step. The city hummed. A distant siren slid past. Ledger stirred and opened one eye. The stairlight threw a warm slice across the rug. He understood finally the truth Maggie had been asking him to accept all along. Trust is not the rope you tie someone with. It is the bridge you build together. Trust is the small, repeated work of being present. Trust is a network. Trust is a set of hands. The world did not end. The kittens grew and left. Ledger stretched and became a cat with moods. Maggie kept her roots. The block stayed a little softer. He learned to be present without owning. He learned to give without the expectation of receipt. He learned to be part of a net rather than a single sentimental savior. He learned small patience, and in that learning found an unexpected sort of peace. You stayed till the end. Thank you. If it felt like a soft hug or a warm purr in your heart, subscribing lets me bring you more moments like this.